In the sleepy village of St. Mary Mead, a glamorous film premiere turns deadly when a poison cocktail claims an innocent life. Was it an accident or a chilling act of revenge? As whispers of a Hollywood scandal resurface, Miss Jane Marple's sharp eyes catch what others miss. A look of dread, a cryptic letter, a shattered mirror. Who is the killer hiding among the stars? And why does the past refuse to stay buried? Unravel the mystery in Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught the mirror-cracked killer, where every clue leads to a shocking truth.
Chapter 1. A Shattered Reflection. The autumn sun dipped low over St. Mary Mead, casting a golden glow across the village's cobbled means and ivy-draped cottages. Miss Jane Marple sat by her window. Her delicate fingers paused mid-stitch as she observed the unusual bustle outside. Tonight, the sleepy hamlet was anything but quiet. A film premiere, of all things, had descended upon the village hall, transforming the quaint space into a stage for glamour and intrigue. The star of the evening, Marina Gregg, a silver screen legend with eyes like storm clouds and a smile that could melt hearts, was the talk of every tongue. Miss Marple, ever the observer of human nature, found the excitement both amusing and faintly suspicious. She adjusted her shawl, her sharp blue eyes scanning the crowd gathering outside the hall. The villagers, dressed in their Sunday best, mingled with a smattering of outsiders, journalists in ill-fitting suits, a few starstruck fans, and the occasional haughty figure from the film world. The premiere was for The Gilded Cage, Marina's triumphant return to acting after a mysterious hiatus. Miss Marple had no particular fondness for cinema, but the buzz had piqued her curiosity. Besides, she'd been invited by Mrs. Dolly Bantry, her dearest friend, who insisted that one simply must see Marina Gregg in person. "Dolly does exaggerate," Miss Marple murmured to herself, a faint smile tugging at her lips. She rose, smoothed her lavender dress, and picked up her cane. Not that she needed it, but it lent a certain gravitas to her presence. With a final glance at her garden, where the last roses clung defiantly to their stems, she stepped out into the crisp evening air. The village hall was a spectacle. Fairy lights twinkled along the eaves, and a red carpet, slightly threadbare, but valiant in its attempt at grandeur, stretched from the street to the entrance. A gaggle of reporters snapped photographs as Marina's entourage arrived in sleek black cars. Miss Marple, unhurried, slipped through the crowd, her unassuming figure drawing little attention. She preferred it that way. It allowed her to watch, to listen, to notice what others missed. Inside, the hall was a riot of color and sound. The scent of polished wood mingled with expensive perfume and the faint tang of champagne. A makeshift screen dominated one end, while tables laden with crystal flutes and canapes lined the walls. Villagers and film folk mingled awkwardly, the former wide-eyed, the latter faintly bored. Miss Marple found Dolly near the refreshment table, her cheeks flushed with excitement. "Jane, you made it!" Dolly exclaimed, her hat adorned with an extravagant peacock feather that bobbed dangerously close to a tray of shrimp. "Isn't it thrilling? Marina Gregg, right here in St. Mary Mead. They say she's even more beautiful in person." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Beauty is a curious thing, Dolly. It often hides more than it reveals." Dolly laughed, waving a hand. "Oh, you and your cryptic remarks. Come, let's get a good spot. She's about to make her entrance." The crowd parted as Marina Gregg swept into the room, her presence like a sudden gust of wind that made everyone turn. She wore a gown of midnight blue, its sequins catching the light like stars. Her dark hair was swept into an elegant chignon, and her smile was radiant, although Miss Marple noted a faint tremor in her hands as she greeted her admirers. Beside her stood her husband, Jason Rudd, a director with a reputation for intensity and a face like a brooding poet. He hovered protectively, his eyes scanning the room as if searching for a threat. Miss Marple settled into a chair near the back, her vantage point perfect for observing the room. She noticed Heather Badcock, a local woman known for her boundless enthusiasm and tendency to dominate conversations. Heather, in a bright pink dress that clashed with her auburn hair, was already making her way toward Marina, her face alight with adoration. "Oh, Miss Gregg," Heather's voice carried over the hum of the crowd. "I'm your biggest fan. I've seen all your films, every single one. I even met you once, years ago, at a charity event in London. You were so kind to sign my program." Marina's smile froze for just a moment. Miss Marple caught it. A flicker of something raw, almost like fear in the actress's eyes. It was gone as quickly as it came, replaced with a practiced warmth. "How lovely to hear," Marina said, her voice smooth as silk. Heather, oblivious to the subtle shift, pressed on. "I was so thrilled when I heard you were coming here. I told everyone at the Women's Institute we've got a real star in St. Mary Mead. I brought my daughter Lucy tonight. She's over there, by the punch bowl. She's shy, but she adores you too."
Marina nodded, her gaze drifting slightly. Jason Rudd stepped in, gently steering his wife toward another group. "We mustn't keep the other guests waiting," he said, his tone polite but firm. Heather beamed, undeterred, and bustled off to fetch a drink. Miss Marple's fingers tightened around her cane. That look in Marina's eyes, it wasn't just surprise or discomfort. It was something deeper, something that spoke of a memory stirred, perhaps unpleasantly. She filed the observation away, her mind already turning over possibilities. The evening progressed with speeches and toasts. Jason Rudd spoke briefly about the film, his voice low and commanding, while Marina charmed the crowd with anecdotes about the set. The lights dimmed and the film began, but Miss Marple's attention remained on the people around her. She noticed the way Jason's assistant, a wiry young man named Colin, hovered near the bar, his eyes darting nervously. She saw the film's co-star, Lola Brewster, a statuesque blonde, shoot a venomous glance at Marina when she thought no one was watching, and she observed Heather Badcock, now chatting animatedly with a group of villagers, a cocktail glass in her hand. Halfway through the screening, a commotion broke out near the refreshment table. Heather Badcock swayed, her face paling as she clutched her throat. Her glass slipped from her hand, shattering on the floor. The room fell silent, the film forgotten, as she crumpled to the ground, gasping. "Help!" Lucy, Heather's daughter, cried, rushing to her mother's side. "She's choking. Someone, please." Dr. Haydock, the village physician, pushed through the crowd. He knelt beside Heather, his face grim as he checked her pulse. "She's not choking. This looks like poisoning. Call an ambulance, now." The hall erupted into chaos. Villagers whispered in horror, while the film crew exchanged uneasy glances. Marina Gregg stood frozen, her hand gripping Jason's arm, her eyes wide with something that looked like recognition. Miss Marple, still seated, watched it all unfold, her mind racing. Poisoning was no accident, not in a setting like this. And that look in Marina's eyes, it was the key. As the ambulance arrived and Heather was carried out, the crowd began to disperse, murmuring about tragedy and bad luck. Dolly, pale and shaken, joined Miss Marple. "Jane, how awful! Poor Heather. Do you think it was an accident? Something in the drink, perhaps?" Miss Marple's lips pursed. "Accidents are rarely so precise, Dolly. Poison requires intent, and intent requires a motive." Dolly's eyes widened. "You think someone did this deliberately? But who would want to harm Heather? She's harmless, if a bit over-enthusiastic." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said softly, her gaze drifting to Marina, who was being ushered out by Jason.
The police arrived, led by Inspector Craddock, a young man who respected Miss Marple's uncanny knack for unraveling mysteries. He questioned the guests, but no one admitted to seeing anything unusual. The cocktail, it seemed, had come from a tray passed around by a waiter who swore he'd noticed nothing amiss. The glass, now in pieces, was collected for analysis, but Miss Marple doubted it would reveal much. The poison, she suspected, had been administered with care. As she walked home with Dolly, the village quiet under a starlit sky, Miss Marple's thoughts churned. She recalled Marina's expression, shock, yes, but also a kind of dreadful certainty, as if she'd seen a ghost from her past. Heather's chatter about their previous meeting had triggered it, Miss Marple was sure. But what could connect a village busybody with a Hollywood star? And why would someone risk such a public act of murder? At her cottage, Miss Marple lit a fire and settled into her armchair, her knitting untouched. She closed her eyes, letting the evening's events replay in her mind. The crowded hall, the glittering lights, the shattered glass, and that fleeting look in Marina's eyes, like a mirror reflecting a truth too painful to face. "Dolly," she said, though her friend had already left, "this is no simple village tragedy. There's a story here, and I intend to read it to the end." She rose, her resolve firm. Tomorrow she would begin her inquiries, starting with Heather's friends at the Women's Institute. Someone, somewhere, knew something, and Miss Marple, with her sharp eyes and sharper mind, would find it. For now, she felt a quiet satisfaction, the kind that came from knowing a puzzle had been set before her, one she was uniquely equipped to solve.
Chapter 2. Whispers in the Village. The morning after the fateful premiere, St. Mary Mead awoke under a veil of unease. The golden hues of autumn seemed muted, as if the village itself mourned the loss of Heather Badcock. Miss Jane Marple, however, was already at work. She sat at her small oak table, a cup of Earl Grey steaming beside her, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as her mind pieced together the fragments of last night's tragedy. The image of Marina Gregg's frozen expression lingered, a puzzle piece that refused to fit neatly into place. Heather's death was no accident. Of that Miss Marple was certain, but the why and the who remained tantalizingly out of reach. She rose, smoothing her tweed skirt, and glanced out her window. The village green was quiet, save for a few early risers hurrying to the bakery or the post office. Gossip, she knew, would be spreading like wildfire, and gossip in St. Mary Mead was a currency Miss Marple wielded with precision. She donned her coat, picked up her wicker basket, and set out for the Women's Institute, where Heather had been a fixture. If anyone knew the threads of Heather's life, it would be the women who shared her teas and committee meetings. The Institute's meeting room, tucked behind the village shop, smelled of lavender polish and freshly baked scones. A dozen women were already gathered, their voices hushed but urgent. Miss Jane Marple slipped in quietly, her unassuming presence barely stirring the air. Mrs. Clara Price, the Institute's formidable chairwoman, was holding court, her pince-nez glinting as she recounted the previous night's horror. "Poor Heather," Clara said, her voice trembling with a mix of grief and relish. "To think it happened right there, in front of us all. Poison, they say. It's like something out of one of those dreadful novels." Miss Jane Marple took a seat near the back, next to young Lucy Badcock, Heather's daughter. Lucy's eyes were red-rimmed, her hands twisting a handkerchief. Miss Marple offered a gentle smile. "My dear, I'm so very sorry. Your mother was such a vibrant soul." Lucy nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "She was so excited about the premiere. She kept talking about meeting Marina Gregg again. I didn't think it would end like this." "Again?" Miss Jane Marple tilted her head, her tones soft but probing. Had she met Miss Gregg before last night? "Oh, yes," Lucy said, brightening slightly at the memory.
years ago at a charity gala in London. Mother was over the moon about it. She said Marina was so gracious, even when Mother was, well, a bit much. She could be, you know." Miss Jane Marple nodded, her mind filing away the detail. "Indeed. Your mother's enthusiasm was quite infectious. Did she mention anything unusual about that meeting recently?" Lucy frowned, her brow furrowing. "Not really. Just that she'd told Marina about it last night, and Marina seemed odd. Like she didn't remember at first, but then she got all quiet. Mother thought maybe she was just tired." Miss Jane Marple's eyes narrowed imperceptibly. Tiredness didn't explain that fleeting look of dread she had seen in Marina's eyes. She patted Lucy's hand. "You've been very brave, my dear. If you think of anything else, do let me know." As Lucy nodded and turned to speak with another mourner, Miss Jane Marple's attention shifted to the other women. She drifted toward a small group clustered around a tray of biscuits, where Mrs. Elsie Harper, the village's most prolific gossip, was in full flow. "I'm telling you, it's that film crowd. All those fancy types with their secrets and their grudges. I saw that assistant of Marina's, Collins something, lurking by the bar last night. Looked nervous as a cat in a rainstorm." Miss Jane Marple leaned in, her tone mild. "Colin, you say? I don't believe I noticed him. Was he near the drinks when Heather took ill?" Elsie's eyes gleamed with the thrill of speculation. "Oh, yes, skulking about he was. And I heard he's got a temper. Snapped at one of the waiters earlier in the evening. If you ask me, he's got something to hide." Miss Jane Marple murmured her thanks and moved on, her mind turning over Elsie's words. Colin's nervousness was worth noting, but gossip was a tangled web, best to verify before weaving it into her theory. She approached Mrs. Beatrice Lane, a quiet woman who ran the village post office and had a knack for noticing details others overlooked. "Beatrice, dear," Miss Jane Marple began, offering a scone from her basket. "You were at the premiere, weren't you? Did you happen to see anything unusual about the drinks table?" Beatrice adjusted her glasses, her voice thoughtful. "Well, now that you mention it, I did see Heather pick up her cocktail from a tray. The waiter was new, didn't recognize him from the village. He seemed in a hurry, kept looking over his shoulder. I thought he was just nervous with all those important people around." Miss Jane Marple's lips pursed. A new waiter, unfamiliar to the village, was a detail worth pursuing. "Did you see where he went after serving Heather?" Beatrice shook her head. "No, he vanished into the crowd, but I did notice something else. There was a letter in Heather's coat pocket when I helped Lucy gather her things last night. It was half torn, but it looked angry. I didn't read it, of course, but it gave me a queer feeling." Miss Jane Marble's heart quickened, though her face remained serene. "A letter, you say? How very interesting. Did you mention it to the police?" "Not yet," Beatrice admitted. "I didn't want to bother them with something that might be nothing. But if you think it's important—" "I think," Miss Jane Marple said gently, "that every detail matters in a case like this. Would you mind if I had a look at it? I could pass it along to Inspector Craddock." Beatrice agreed, promising to retrieve the letter from her home. Miss Jane Marple thanked her and excused herself, her mind buzzing. A letter, an unfamiliar waiter, and Marina's strange reaction. Each was a thread in a tapestry she was only beginning to weave. She decided to visit the vicarage next, where the vicar's wife, Mrs. Clement, was hosting a small memorial tea for Heather. It was the perfect place to glean more insights without arousing suspicion. The vicarage was a cozy haven, its parlor filled with the scent of chamomile tea and the soft clink of china. Mrs. Clement, a kind but slightly flustered woman, welcomed Miss Jane Marple warmly. "Jane, how good you are to come. Poor Heather, she was full of life. It's hard to believe she's gone."
"Indeed," Miss Marple said, settling into a chintz-covered chair. "She was a great asset to the village. Did she seem herself in the days leading up to the premiere?" Mrs. Clement hesitated, pouring tea with a slightly unsteady hand. Well, she was her usual cheery self, but now that you mention it, she did seem a bit preoccupied last week. She came by to drop off some raffle tickets for the church fete and mentioned she'd been getting odd phone calls. Just silence on the other end, then a click. She laughed it off, but I could tell it bothered her. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened, though her voice remained soft. Odd phone calls? Did she say how often? 2 or 3 times, I think, Mrs. Clement replied. She thought it might be a prank, but with all this talk of poison. Oh, Jane, do you think it's connected? It's too early to say, Miss Marple said, sipping her tea. But it's worth noting. Did Heather mention anyone she might have upset recently? She was so outgoing, after all. Mrs. Clement shook her head. Not that I recall, though she did mention a disagreement with Mr. Giles, the florist, something about a delivery for the premiere that went wrong. But that's hardly a motive for, well, you know. Miss Marple nodded, her mind cataloguing the information. Mr. Giles was a mild-mannered man, unlikely to resort to murder over a botched order, but she made a mental note to speak with him. The silent phone calls, however, were more troubling. They suggested someone had been watching Heather, perhaps planning something long before the premiere. As the tea drew to a close, Miss Marple excused herself and stepped into the vicarage garden, where the last of the dahlias bloomed in defiant bursts of color. She stood for a moment, letting the pieces of the puzzle settle in her mind. Heather's death, the letter, the waiter, the phone calls, and Marina's reaction all pointed to a deeper motive, one that likely stretched beyond the village's borders. But the key, she suspected, lay in that long-ago meeting between Heather and Marina. What had Heather said or done to provoke such a visceral response? Her next stop was Beatrice's home, a tidy cottage near the post office. Beatrice greeted her at the door. "Here it is, Miss Marple," she said, holding a crumpled envelope. "I didn't open it, but it's definitely Heather's. Her name's on the front." Miss Marple took the envelope, her fingers tracing the jagged tear along one edge. The handwriting was sharp, almost aggressive, with no return address. "Thank you, Beatrice. I'll see that Inspector Craddock gets this. You've been most helpful." Back at her cottage, Miss Marple settled by the fire, the envelope in her lap. She opened it carefully, revealing a single sheet of paper. The message was brief, but chilling. "You'll pay for what you did. No one forgets." No signature, no clue as to the sender, but the venom in the words was unmistakable. Miss Marple's lips tightened. This was no random act of malice. Someone had targeted Heather, or someone close to her, with deliberate intent. She leaned back, her knitting resumed, the needles moving in a soothing rhythm. The letter suggested a grudge, perhaps tied to that long-ago meeting with Marina years ago. But why poison a cocktail at a crowded premiere? The risk, the audacity? It pointed to a killer who was either desperate or supremely confident. And then there was Marina's expression, that moment of shock that had nothing to do with Heather's collapse. Miss Marple's instincts told her the poison was meant for someone else, someone whose death would have caused far greater ripples. As the fire crackled, she sipped her tea, her mind alight with possibilities. The village was whispering, and Miss Marple was listening. She would visit Mr. Giles tomorrow, and perhaps track down that mysterious waiter. For now, she felt a quiet satisfaction, the kind that came with knowing she was on the right path. The truth was out there, hidden in the folds of St. Mary Mead's everyday life, and she would find it, one whispered secret at a time.
Chapter 3. Shadows of the Silver Screen. The morning mist clung to St. Mary Mead like a gossamer shroud, softening the edges of the village's stone walls and thatched roofs. Miss Jane Marple stood at her garden gate, her breath visible in the chilly air, her sharp eyes scanning the lane.
The events of the premiere and the whispers gathered at the Women's Institute had only deepened her conviction that Heather Badcock's death was a thread in a much larger tapestry, one woven with secrets that stretched beyond the village's borders. Today she would venture into the heart of the film world, to the set of The Gilded Cage, where Marina Gregg and her entourage were still ensconced. If answers lay anywhere, it was among the egos and rivalries of those who lived in the spotlight. She adjusted her hat, a sensible affair with a single velvet rose, and made her way to the bus stop. The film set was at Mead House, a grand estate on the outskirts of the village, temporarily transformed into a Hollywood playground. Miss Marple had secured an invitation through Dolly Bantry, whose cousin owned the property, and was thrilled to have it featured in a film. "Just don't get starstruck, Jane," Dolly had teased, but Miss Marple had only smiled. Stars, she knew, were merely people, and people always had secrets. The bus rattled along the country lanes, depositing her at Dane Mead's wrought iron gates. A young man in a clipboard-wielding frenzy, clearly a production assistant, eyed her skeptically. "Name?" he barked, barely glancing up. "Jane Marple," she replied, her voice mild but firm. "I'm expected. Mrs. Bantry arranged it." He scanned his list, muttered something about civilians, and waved her through. Miss Marple stepped onto the estate, her cane tapping lightly on the gravel path. The scene before her was a whirlwind of activity. Cameras on cranes, technicians shouting instructions, and actors lounging in canvas chairs, their faces a mix of boredom and vanity. Dane Mead's manicured lawns were littered with cables and props, and the air hummed with the electric anticipation of creation. She spotted Marina Gregg at once, standing near a rose arbor that served as a backdrop for a scene. Marina was luminous, even in the morning light, her auburn hair catching the sun as she rehearsed her lines. But Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the actress's hands, which twisted a silk scarf with nervous energy. Beside her, Jason Rudd, her director husband, barked orders at a lighting technician, his face taut with frustration. The tension between them was palpable, a silent storm brewing beneath their professional veneer. Miss Marple found a bench near a catering table where she could observe without drawing attention. She pulled out her knitting, the click of her needles blending with the set's cacophony. Her eyes, however, were everywhere. She noted Colin, Marina's assistant, hovering near a trailer, his wiry frame tense as he scribbled in a notebook. She saw Lola Brewster, the film's co-star, pacing near a fountain, her blonde curls bouncing as she muttered to herself, her expression sour. And she noticed a cracked mirror propped against a prop table, its jagged edges glinting like a warning. The sight sent a shiver through her, stirring a memory of Tennyson's poem. The mirror cracked from side to side. "The curse is come upon me," cried the Lady of Shalott. "Curious," Miss Marple murmured, her needles pausing. A cracked mirror on a film set was hardly unusual. Accidents happen. But its presence felt like a sign, a reflection of something broken in this glittering world. She was interrupted by a young woman in a headscarf who approached with a tray of coffee cups. "Would you like one, ma'am?" she asked, her voice tinged with a London accent. "Thank you, dear," Miss Marple said, accepting a cup. "You must be terribly busy with all this going on. Are you part of the crew?" The girl, whose name tag read Maggie, nodded. "Runner, mostly. I fetch things, keep the set tidy. It's chaos, but it pays well." Miss Marple smiled, her tone conspiratorial.
I imagine you see all sorts of things scurrying about. Did you happen to be at the premiere the other night? Such a dreadful business with poor Mrs. Badcock." Maggie's face tightened, and she glanced over her shoulder. "I was there, yeah. Horrible what happened. I didn't see much, though. I was stuck in the back cleaning up spills." "But you must hear things," Miss Marple pressed gently. "People talk, don't they? About Miss Gregg, perhaps, or her husband?" Maggie hesitated, then leaned closer. "Well, there's always talk. Marina's a sweetheart, but she's fragile, you know? Jason's always watching her like she might break. And Lola, Miss Brewster, she's got a temper. Threw a fit yesterday when her scene got cut short. Said Marina was stealing her light, whatever that means."
Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. How fascinating! And the young man, Colin, he seems rather intense. Maggie snorted. That's one way to put it. He's devoted to Marina, but he's got a chip on his shoulder. Snapped at me last week for moving his clipboard. Said he's got enough to deal with, what with her past coming back to haunt them. Her past? Miss Marple's voice was soft, almost lost in the set's noise, but her gaze was sharp. Maggie flushed, realizing she'd said too much. "Oh, I shouldn't have. Look, I've got to run. Enjoy the coffee." She scurried off, leaving Miss Marple to ponder her words. The phrase, "her past," echoed in her mind. Marina's reaction at the premiere, the angry letter found in Heather's pocket, the silent phone calls, they all pointed to something buried, something that had resurfaced with deadly consequences. Miss Marple's gaze drifted back to the cracked mirror, its fractured surface reflecting the chaos around her. She resolved to speak with Colin, but first she wanted a closer look at Lola Brewster. She found the actress near a costume rack, adjusting her makeup in a handheld mirror. Lola's face was a study in controlled fury, her lips pursed as she dabbed at her cheeks. Miss Marple approached, her demeanor as unthreatening as a village spinster could manage. "Miss Brewster, I presume," she said, her voice warm. "I'm Jane Marple, a friend of Mrs. Bantry's. I must say, your presence on this set is quite captivating." Lola's eyes flicked up, assessing Miss Marple with a mix of suspicion and boredom. "Thanks, I suppose. It's not exactly the West End, is it?" Miss Marple chuckled. "No, but St. Mary Mead has its charms. Were you at the premiere? I'm afraid the tragedy rather overshadowed the evening." Lola's expression hardened. "Yes, that poor woman. Yes, I was there, but I was busy with the press. Didn't see much. Poison, though. That's dramatic even for us." "Indeed," Miss Marple said, her tone thoughtful. "It must be difficult working in such a high-stakes world. I imagine tensions run high, especially with someone as luminous as Miss Gregg." Lola's mirror snapped shut, her eyes narrowing. "Marina's a star, all right. Gets all the attention, all the best scenes. Some of us have to fight for our place in the sun." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. "It must be trying. Have you known her long?" "Long enough," Lola said, her voice clipped. "We worked together years ago in Hollywood. She had a knack for making enemies back then, too. Not that I'm surprised. She's got that way of making you feel small without even trying." Miss Marple's heart quickened, but she kept her expression bland. "Enemies? How unfortunate. Anyone in particular?" Lola shrugged, her gaze drifted to the set. "Oh, you know how it is. Old grudges, broken promises. Hollywood's a snake pit. But that's ancient history." She stood abruptly, tossing her hair. "Excuse me, I've got a scene to prep for." As Lola strode away, Miss Marple's mind raced. Lola's bitterness was more than professional rivalry. It had the weight of something personal, perhaps tied to that Hollywood past Maggie had mentioned. She made a mental note to dig deeper into Marina's history, but for now she turned her attention to Colin, who was now arguing with a sound technician near a trailer. She approached slowly, her knitting tucked into her basket. Colin's face was flushed, his hands gesturing wildly as he berated the technician for a misplaced microphone. When he noticed Miss Marple, he froze, his expression shifting to guarded politeness. "Yes," he said, his voice sharp. "Can I help you?" Miss Marple smiled, undeterred. "I'm Jane Marple, a guest of Mrs. Bantry's. I must say, you must be terribly busy keeping everything in order for Miss Gregg." The Colin's shoulders relaxed slightly, but his eyes remained wary. "It's a job. Marina's worth it, though. She's a genius." "She certainly is," Miss Marple said, her tone admiring. "It must be quite a responsibility looking after her, especially after such a dreadful event at the premiere. Did you know Mrs. Badcock?" Colin's jaw tightened, and he glanced away. "Not really. Just another fan, always hanging around. Marina gets a lot of those." "But this one met a tragic end," Miss Marple said softly. "I understand she mentioned a previous meeting with Miss Gregg. Did that stir any memories for you?" Colin's eyes flicked back to her, a flash of unease crossing his face. "I don't know anything about that. I wasn't with Marina back then. Look, I've got work to do." He turned abruptly, striding toward the trailer. Miss Marple watched him go, her mind cataloguing his reaction. Colin's defensiveness suggested he knew more than he let on, perhaps about Marina's past or the events of that long-ago meeting with Heather. She was about to follow when she noticed Jason Rudd approaching, his dark eyes fixed on her. "Miss Marple, isn't it?" he said, his voice smooth but edged with caution. "Dolly mentioned you'd be visiting. Enjoying the set?" "Very much so," she replied, her smile serene. "It's quite a spectacle, though I imagine it's been a difficult time with the tragedy at the premiere." Jason's face darkened, but he nodded. "A terrible thing. Marina's shaken, of course. She's sensitive to these things." "I'm sure," Miss Marple said. "She seemed quite affected when Mrs. Badcock spoke to her, almost as if she remembered something unsettling." Jason's eyes narrowed, but his tone remained polite. "Marina meets so many fans, it's hard to keep track. If you'll excuse me, we're about to shoot a scene." He moved off, but Miss Marple caught the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand clenched at his side. Jason was protective, perhaps overly so. Was he shielding Marina from the past, or from scrutiny? As the day wore on, Miss Marple lingered on the set, her presence as unobtrusive as a shadow. She overheard snippets of conversation, a grip complaining about Lola's demands, a makeup artist whispering about Marina's late-night phone calls, and a prop master grumbling about the cracked mirror, which had been perfectly fine until someone tampered with it. Each fragment added to her growing suspicion that the poison at the premiere was no random act. It was personal, tied to Marina's world, and the cracked mirror was a symbol of something fractured, perhaps a life, a promise, or a secret. As the day wore on, Miss Marple lingered on the set, her presence as unobtrusive as a shadow. She overheard snippets of conversation, a grip complaining about Lola's demands, a makeup artist whispering about Marina's late-night phone calls, and a prop master grumbling about the cracked mirror, which had been perfectly fine until someone tampered with it. Each fragment added to her growing suspicion that the poison at the premiere was no random act. It was personal, tied to Marina's world, and the cracked mirror was a symbol of something fractured, perhaps a life, a promise, or a secret. As the day wore on, Miss Marple lingered on the set, her presence as unobtrusive as a shadow. She overheard snippets of conversation, a grip complaining about Lola's demands, a makeup artist whispering about Marina's late-night phone calls, and a prop master grumbling about the cracked mirror, which had been perfectly fine until someone tampered with it. Each fragment added to her growing suspicion that the poison at the premiere was no random act. It was personal, tied to Marina's world, and the cracked mirror was a symbol of something fractured, perhaps a life, a promise, or a secret. As the day wore on, Miss Marple lingered on the set, her presence as unobtrusive as a shadow. She overheard snippets of conversation, a grip complaining about Lola's demands, a makeup artist whispering about Marina's late-night phone calls, and a prop master grumbling about the cracked mirror, which had been perfectly fine until someone tampered with it. Each fragment added to her growing suspicion that the poison at the premiere was no random act. It was personal, tied to Marina's world, and the cracked mirror was a symbol of something fractured, perhaps a life, a promise, or a secret. As the day wore on, Miss Marple lingered on the set, her presence as unobtrusive as a shadow. She overheard snippets of conversation, a grip complaining about Lola's demands, a makeup artist whispering about Marina's late-night
phone calls, and a prop master grumbling about the cracked mirror, which had been perfectly fine until someone tampered with it. Each fragment added to her growing suspicion that the poison at the premiere was no random act. It was personal, tied to Marina's world, and the cracked mirror was a symbol of something fractured, perhaps a life, a promise, or a secret. By late afternoon, the set began to wind down, and Miss Marple made her way back to the bus stop, her basket heavier with questions than when she'd arrived. The cracked mirror, Lola's bitterness, Colin's unease, and Jason's protectiveness all pointed to a web of motives, but the heart of it lay in Marina's past. What had Heather Badcock unwittingly stirred when she'd gushed about their meeting, and why had it cost her her life? As the bus trundled back to St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple gazed out at the rolling hills, her knitting needles still. The village awaited her, its quiet lanes hiding their own secrets. She would visit Mr. Giles, the florist, tomorrow, and perhaps track down the mysterious waiter Beatrice had mentioned. For now, she felt a quiet satisfaction, the kind that came with knowing she'd uncovered new threads in the tapestry. The mirror might be cracked, but Miss Marple's vision was clear, and she was determined to see the truth reflected in its shards.
Chapter 4. The Tangled Web of Motives. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across St. Mary Mead, painting the village in hues of amber and rose. Miss Jane Marple sat in her parlor, her knitting needles idle in her lap, a rare occurrence that betrayed the intensity of her thoughts. The cracked mirror on the film set, Lola Brewster's venomous glances, Colin's guarded demeanor, and Jason Rudd's protective vigilance had woven a complex pattern in her mind. But the heart of the mystery still eluded her. Heather Badcock's death was no random tragedy. It was a calculated act, and Miss Marple was certain the key lay in Marina Gregg's past, a past that had cast a long shadow over the present. Her visit to the film set had confirmed that the poison was likely meant for someone else, perhaps Marina herself, given her startled reaction when Heather spoke of their past meeting. The anonymous letter found in Heather's pocket, with its chilling warning, "You'll pay for what you did, no one forgets," suggested a vendetta, but against whom? Miss Marple's instincts told her that the answer lay not just in St. Mary Mead, but in the glittering, treacherous world of Hollywood, where Marina once reigned supreme.
She rose, smoothing her cardigan, and decided to pursue a new lead, Mr. Giles, the florist, whom Mrs. Clement had mentioned in connection with a disagreement with Heather. It was a slender thread, but Miss Marple knew that even the smallest detail could unravel a mystery. She also needed to learn more about Marina's Hollywood days, and for that she would need a source less guarded than the film set's denizens. As she gathered her shawl and basket, a plan formed: a visit to the florist, followed by an afternoon tea at the Blue Boar Inn, where she hoped to encounter someone with ties to the film world's gossip mill. The florist shop, a quaint establishment tucked between the butcher and the bakery, was a riot of color and scent. Roses, lilies, and chrysanthemums spilled from buckets, their fragrance mingling with the earthy tang of potting soil. Mr. Giles, a wiry man with a perpetually furrowed brow, was arranging a bouquet of dahlias when Miss Marple entered. "Good afternoon, Mr. Giles," she said, her voice warm and unassuming. "What lovely flowers! I'm looking for something cheerful for my sitting room, perhaps some of those marigolds." Mr. Giles brightened, always pleased to discuss his craft. "Marigolds, Miss Marple. A fine choice. They're sturdy, full of life." He paused, his hand stilling, not like poor Mrs. Badcock. Terrible business, that. "Indeed," Miss Marple said, her tone sympathetic. "I understand you worked with her on the floral arrangements for the premiere. It must have been quite a task." Mr. Giles' face clouded. "It was, and no thanks to her, if I may say so. Heather was a good sort, but she had a way of taking over, kept changing the order, roses one day, lilies the next, said it had to be perfect for Miss Gregg, nearly drove me to distraction." Miss Marple tilted her head, her eyes keen. "That sounds trying. Did she mention why she was so particular about pleasing Miss Gregg?" Mr. Giles shrugged, snipping a stem with more force than necessary. "Said she'd met her years ago and wanted to make an impression. Kept going on about some charity event in London. I told her it was just flowers, not a royal coronation, but she wouldn't hear it. Then when one of the bouquets arrived late, my supplier's fault, mind you, she gave me an earful in front of half the village." Miss Marple nodded, her mind cataloguing the detail. Heather's obsession with Marina was becoming a pattern, one that had evidently stirred something dangerous. "Did you notice anything unusual at the premiere? Perhaps anyone lingering near the arrangements?" Mr. Giles frowned, his hands pausing. "Now that you mention it, there was a chap hanging about the display table. Not one of my lads, a stranger, tall with a scarf pulled up high. Thought he was just admiring the flowers, but he seemed shifty. Didn't stay long." "A stranger?" Miss Marple's voice was soft, but her pulse quickened. "Did you see where he went?" "Out the side door, I think. Didn't think much of it at the time, with all the chaos, but with what happened to Heather." He trailed off, his face paling. Miss Marple thanked him and purchased a small bunch of marigolds, her mind racing. A mysterious stranger at the premiere, combined with the unfamiliar waiter Beatrice had mentioned, suggested an outsider's involvement. But why target Heather or Marina in such a public way? She resolved to pass this information to Inspector Craddock, but first she needed to delve into Marina's past. The Blue Boar Inn was a bustling hub of village life, its low-beam ceilings and polished oak tables filled with locals and the occasional film crew member seeking respite from the set. Miss Marple settled into a corner booth, her marigolds adding a splash of color to the table. She ordered a pot of Darjeeling and scanned the room, her eyes landing on a familiar face, Mrs. Ada Finch, a retired seamstress who had once worked in London's theatre district and was known for her encyclopedic knowledge of showbiz gossip. Mrs. Finch, her silver hair piled high, was sipping sherry and chatting with the innkeeper. Miss Marple caught her eye and beckoned her over, her smile inviting. "Ada, how delightful to see you! Would you join me for a cup of tea?" Mrs. Finch, never one to decline a chat, bustled over. "Jane Marple, you old fox, what brings you here? Not just the tea, I wager." Miss Marple chuckled, pouring a cup for her guest. "You know me too well. I've been thinking about poor Mrs. Badcock and that dreadful business at the premiere. It's got me curious about Marina's world. You used to work in the theater, didn't you? Did you ever hear anything about Marina Gregg's time in Hollywood?" Mrs. Finch's eyes gleamed, her voice dropping to a conspiratory whisper. "Oh, Marina Gregg. She was the talk of the town in her day. A real siren, but trouble followed her like a shadow. There was a scandal, must be 15 years ago now, when she was filming Starlight Serenade. Fell hard for a producer, Vincent Harlow. Married man, of course, with a jealous wife. Rumor was Marina got pregnant, but it all went wrong. There was an accident, a car crash, some say, sabotage. Vincent died, and Marina disappeared for a year. Never quite the same after that." Miss Marple's fingers tightened around her teacup, though her face remained serene. "That tragic. Was there ever any talk of enemies? Someone who might have blamed Marina?" Mrs. Finch leaned closer, her voice barely audible. "Plenty. Vincent's wife, Clara Harlow, swore Marina had ruined her life. There was talk she'd threatened revenge, though nothing came of it. And then there was a young actress, can't recall her name, who lost a big role to Marina. She was bitter as gall, spread all sorts of stories. Hollywood's a nest of vipers, Jane. You don't get to Marina's heights without stepping on toes."
Miss Marple nodded, her mind weaving the new information into her theory. A jilted wife, a betrayed actress, a tragic accident. It was a potent mix, one that could explain the venom in that anonymous letter. But how did Heather Badcock fit into it? Had her chance meeting with Marina all those years ago touched a nerve, perhaps unwittingly revealing a secret? "Thank you, Ada," Miss Marple said, her tone warm. "You've been most illuminating. Do let me know if you remember that actress's name." As Mrs. Finch returned to her sherry, Miss Marple sipped her tea, her thoughts racing. The scandal Mrs. Finch described mirrored the current crime in unsettling ways. A sudden death, a web of jealousy, a woman at the center of it all. She needed to speak with Colin again, to see if he knew anything about this Hollywood drama. But first, she had another lead to pursue, the village fete, scheduled for that evening, where the film crew had promised to make an appearance. It was the perfect opportunity to observe them in a less guarded setting. The fete was held on the village green, a merry affair, with bunting strung between lampposts and stalls offering homemade jams, knitted scarves, and games of chance. The air was thick with the scent of toffee apples and the sound of children's laughter, but Miss Marple sensed an undercurrent of tension. The villagers were still reeling from Heather's death, and the presence of the film crew added a layer of unease. She wandered among the stalls, her basket swinging lightly, her eyes scanning the crowd. Marina and Jason were there, posing for photographs with forced smiles. Lola Brewster was conspicuously absent, but Colin was present, hovering near a coconut shy, his expression taut. Miss Marple approached a lemonade stand where a young woman named Sarah, a local who worked part-time as a waitress, was serving drinks. "Good evening, Sarah," Miss Marple said, accepting a glass. "You must be rushed off your feet. Were you at the premiere by any chance?" Sarah nodded, wiping her hands on her apron. "I was, Miss Marple. Helped with the catering. It was awful what happened to Mrs. Babcock. I saw her take that cocktail, just picked it up from a tray, like anyone else." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "And the waiter who served it? Did you know him?" Sarah frowned, thinking. "Not really. He was new, hired for the night. Kept to himself, but I saw him talking to Colin earlier. Looked like they were arguing, but I couldn't hear what about." Miss Marple thanked her and moved on, her mind buzzing. Colin's involvement was becoming harder to ignore. She spotted him now, standing alone near a ring-toss game, his hands stuffed in his pockets. She approached him, her demeanor as unthreatening as ever. "Colin, isn't it?" she said, her voice gentle. "What a charming fate. I imagine it's a welcome change from the film set." Colin's eyes flicked to her, wary but polite. "It's all right. Marina needed a break, so we're here. What do you want?" Miss Marple smiled, undeterred by his brusqueness. "I was just thinking about poor Mrs. Badcock. It's so strange how a simple evening turned so tragic. Did you happen to see who served her drink?" Colin's face hardened. "I was busy with Marina. I didn't see anything. Why do you care?" "Oh, just an old woman's curiosity," Miss Marple said, her tone light. "But I heard you had a disagreement with one of the waiters that night. Nothing serious, I hope." Colin's jaw clenched, and for a moment she thought he might walk away, but then he sighed, his shoulders slumping. "It was nothing, just some idiot who spilled a tray of glasses. I told him to be more careful. Marina's got enough on her plate with accidents." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes never leaving his face. "Of course. And Miss Gregg, she must be under such strain, with her past being so eventful. I heard there was a tragedy in Hollywood years ago. A producer, perhaps." Colin's eyes widened, and he took a step back. "Who told you that? Look, that's ancient history. Marina's moved on, and so should everyone else." He turned abruptly, striding toward the crowd. Miss Marple watched him go, her mind racing. Colin's reaction confirmed that the Hollywood scandal was a sensitive topic, one he was keen to bury. But before she could pursue the thought, a scream pierced the air, followed by a commotion near the refreshment tent. The crowd parted, revealing a young woman, a local named Jenny, who worked at the bakery, clutching her throat, her face pale. She staggered, then collapsed, a glass of lemonade spilling from her hand. Miss Marple's heart sank, but she moved swiftly, her cane tapping as she reached the scene. Dr. Haydock was already there, his face grim as he checked Jenny's pulse. "She's alive," he said, relief in his voice. "But it's the same symptoms, convulsions, pallor. Someone fetch my bag." The crowd buzzed with panic, whispers of another poisoning spreading like wildfire. Miss Marple's eyes scanned the scene, noting the overturned glass, the scattered crowd, and the absence of the film crew who had slipped away in the chaos. Jenny was rushed to the hospital, and Inspector Craddock arrived, his face drawn as he cordoned off the area. Miss Marple approached him, her voice low. "Inspector, I believe this was no accident. The lemonade was likely tampered with, just like Heather's cocktail. But I suspect the target was someone else, perhaps Miss Gregg again." Craddock acknowledged, his expression weary. "We're testing the glass now, but 2 poisonings in a week. This is no coincidence. Any thoughts, Miss Marple?" She hesitated, then shared her findings: the stranger at the premiere, the letter, the Hollywood scandal, and Colin's evasiveness. "There's a pattern here, Inspector. Someone is striking at Marina or those close to her. Heather's death was a mistake, I'm sure of it." Craddock promised to investigate, and Miss Marple returned home, her mind alight with new connections. The second poisoning attempt confirmed her theory. The killer was targeting Marina, and Heather had been an unfortunate casualty. The Hollywood scandal, Vincent Harlow's death, his wife's threats, the bitter actress, provided a motive, but the killer's identity remained elusive. As she sat by her fire, her knitting resumed, the needles clicking in rhythm with her thoughts. The tangled web of motives was clearer now: jealousy, revenge, a past that refused to stay buried. She would need to tread carefully, but Miss Marple felt a quiet satisfaction, the kind that came with knowing she was closing in on the truth. Tomorrow she would confront Colin again, and perhaps uncover the name of that forgotten actress. For now, she sipped her tea, the fire's glow casting shadows that danced like the secrets she was determined to unravel.
Chapter 5. The Mask Slips. The twilight air in St. Mary Mead carried a crisp edge, as if the village itself held its breath after the second poisoning attempt at the fete. Miss Jane Marple stood at her cottage window, her gaze fixed on the darkening sky.
her mind a whirl of connections. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place. Heather Badcock's death, the near-fatal poisoning of Jenny, the cryptic letter, and the shadow of Marina Gregg's Hollywood past. The cracked mirror on the film set, a haunting echo of Tennyson's poem, lingered in her thoughts, symbolizing a truth fractured but not yet fully revealed. Miss Marple was certain now. The poison was meant for Marina, and Heather's death had been a tragic misstep. Tonight, at the village's charity gala, she would set a trap to unmask the killer. The gala, held in the grand hall of Much Benham Manor, was a glittering affair meant to raise funds for the local orphanage. The film crew's presence ensured a large turnout, with villagers and outsiders mingling under chandeliers that cast a warm glow over polished floors and velvet drapes. Miss Jean Marple arrived early, her cane a quiet companion as she surveyed the room. Her plan was simple but daring. Spread a subtle rumor that a witness had seen the poisoner at the fete, then watch for a reaction. A guilty conscience, she knew, was a fragile thing, easily betrayed by a careless glance or a trembling hand. She found Dolly Bantry near a table laden with crystal flutes and petit fours, her friend's eyes sparkling with excitement despite the recent tragedies. "Jane, you look positively conspiratorial," she whispered, her emerald earrings catching the light. "What are you up to?" Miss Jane Marple's lips curved into a faint smile. "Just a little observation, Dolly. I have a notion that someone here knows more than they're letting on. Would you be a dear and mention to a few people, discreetly mind, that a witness saw someone tampering with the lemonade at the fete? No names, just a hint." Dolly's eyebrows shot up, but she nodded, her curiosity piqued. "You're up to something, aren't you? I'll spread the word, but be careful, Jane, this isn't one of your knitting patterns." Miss Marple chuckled softly and moved toward a corner where she could observe the crowd. The gala was in full swing, with a string quartet playing a lilting waltz and guests swirling across the dance floor. Marina Gregg stood near the center, her silver gown shimmering like moonlight, her smile radiant but brittle. Jason Rudd hovered nearby, his dark eyes scanning the room with a vigilance that bordered on paranoia. Lola Brewster, resplendent in crimson, laughed too loudly at a producer's joke, her gaze darting toward Marina with barely concealed resentment. Colin, Marina's assistant, lingered near a side table, his hands fidgeting with a napkin. Miss Marple's rumor began to take root. She caught snippets of whispered conversations as Dolly worked her magic. "They say someone saw the poisoner near the lemonade stand. No one knows who, but the police are close." The air grew taut, like a string stretched to breaking. She watched Colin closely, noting the way his shoulders stiffened, his eyes flicking toward the exits. Lola's laughter grew sharper, her movements more restless. Even Marina seemed affected, her hand tightening around her glass as she leaned closer to Jason. As the evening progressed, Miss Marple positioned herself near a marble pillar, her knitting tucked away, but her senses sharp. She noticed a young woman, Ellen, a local who worked as a cleaner at Mead House, hovering near the refreshment table. Ellen's face was pale, her hands twisting the hem of her apron as she arranged glasses. Miss Marple approached her, her voice gentle but probing. "Good evening, Ellen," she said, offering a warm smile. "You've done a splendid job with the arrangements. Were you at the fete last night? I heard there was quite a stir." Ellen started, nearly dropping a glass. "Oh, Miss Marple, yes, I was there, helping with the stalls. It was awful what happened to Jenny. I didn't see anything, though." Miss Marple tilted her head, her eyes kind but piercing.
Of course, dear. But you're often at Mead, aren't you? You must hear things working so closely with the film crew. Perhaps something about Miss Gregg's assistant, Colin. Ellen's cheeks flushed, and she glanced around nervously. Colin's intense, always running around for Marina. I heard him arguing with someone on the phone a few days ago in the garden at Mead. He was whispering, but he sounded angry. Something about keeping it quiet and not letting her find out. I didn't think much of it until, well, everything. Miss Marple's heart quickened, but her expression remained serene. How very interesting. Did you recognize the voice on the other end? Ellen shook her head. No, it was too muffled, but he was pacing like he was scared. I shouldn't have said anything. I don't want trouble. You've done no harm, dear, Miss Marple assured her, patting her hand. You've been most helpful. As Ellen hurried back to her duties, Miss Marple's mind raced. Colin's secretive phone call suggested he was hiding something, perhaps tied to the Hollywood scandal Mrs. Finch had mentioned, a scandal involving a dead producer, a vengeful wife, and a bitter actress. Could Colin be protecting Marina, or was he entangled in a darker scheme? She needed to push him to see if her rumor would shake loose a confession. She glifted toward the dance floor, where couples swayed to a slow melody. Colin was now near a window, his back to the room, his posture rigid. Miss Marple approached, her cane tapping softly, her voice as mild as ever. Colin, what a lovely evening, though I imagine it's hard to enjoy with all this talk of a witness at the fete. Colin spun around, his eyes wide with alarm. Witness? What witness? There's nothing to see. Miss Marple's eyebrows rose slightly, her tone soothing. Oh, just village gossip, I'm sure. Someone claims they saw a figure tampering with the lemonade. The police are quite interested, I hear. Colin's face paled, and his hand slipped into his pocket, emerging with a small glass vial that glinted in the chandelier's light. He froze, realizing his mistake, and in a moment of panic, the vial slipped from his hands, rolling across the floor. The room fell silent, all eyes turning to the tiny object as it came to rest near a velvet curtain.
Miss Marple's voice cut through the hush, calm but commanding. "Inspector Craddock, I believe you'll want to see this." Craddock, who had been mingling discreetly, strode forward, his face grim as he retrieved the vial with a handkerchief. "What's this, then?" he asked, his eyes locking on to Colin. Colin's composure shattered, his voice trembling. "It's nothing, just medicine. I swear, I didn't do anything." Marina, who had been watching from across the room, pushed through the crowd, her face ashen. "Colin, what have you done?" she whispered, her voice breaking. Jason stepped between them, his expression fierce. "Leave him alone. He's loyal to a fault. This is nonsense." But Miss Marple's gaze was unwavering. "Loyalty can be a dangerous thing, Mr. Rudd, especially when it's driven by guilt. Colin, I believe you know more about the poisonings than you've let on. Perhaps something about Miss Gregg's past? A tragedy in Hollywood, perhaps." Colin's eyes darted to Marina, then back to Miss Marple, his resolve crumbling. "I didn't mean for anyone to die," he blurted, his voice raw. "It was Clara Harlow, Vincent's wife. She's been writing to Marina, threatening her for years, ever since the accident. I found out she was in England, planning something. I thought if I could stage an attack, make it look like someone tried to poison Marina, she'd leave, go somewhere safe. But the cocktail, it got to the wrong person. And then Jenny at the fete, I panicked, tried again, but I diluted it. I didn't want anyone to die." Miss Marple's eyes softened, though her voice was steady. "And the letter in Heather's pocket, was that your doing to make the threat seem real?" Colin nodded, tears streaming down his face. "I wrote it, planted it. I thought it would convince Marina to run. I didn't know Heather would die. I just wanted to protect her." Marina's face crumpled and she turned away, her shoulders shaking. Jason glared at Colin, his voice low. "You fool! You nearly destroyed her." Craddock signaled to a constable, who led Colin away, his hands cuffed. The gala dissolved into murmurs, the villagers stunned, the film crew shaken. Miss Marple watched it all, her heart heavy but her mind clear. Colin's misguided loyalty had cost one life and nearly another, but the true shadow, Clara Harlow, remained at large. She would need to speak with Marina to learn the full truth of that Hollywood tragedy, but for now, the village was safe. As the crowd dispersed, Dolly joined her, her eyes wide. "Jane, you're a marvel. How did you know?" Miss Marple smiled faintly, adjusting her shawl. "People are not so different, Dolly, whether in St. Mary Mead or Hollywood. A guilty heart always betrays itself, given a little push." They stepped into the cool night air, the manor's lights fading behind them. Miss Marple felt a quiet satisfaction, the kind that came with seeing justice served, even if the full story remained incomplete. Tomorrow, she would unravel the final threads, but for now, she walked home under the stars, her cane tapping a steady rhythm, her mind already turning to the next piece of the puzzle.
Chapter 6. The Mirror's Truth. The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Jane Marple's cottage, casting delicate patterns across her parlor. She sat in her favorite armchair, a tray of tea and scones on the table beside her, her knitting neatly folded in its basket. The events of the charity gala the previous night lingered in her mind like the afterglow of a storm. Colin's confession had unraveled the mystery of Heather Badcock's death and Jenny's near-fatal poisoning, but it was not the end of the story. The shadow of Clara Harlow, the vengeful widow from Marina Gregg's Hollywood past, loomed large, and Miss Marple knew the final threads of the tapestry needed weaving. Today, she would meet with her friend Dolly Bantry to reflect on the case and ensure no loose ends remained. The village of St. Mary Mead had settled into an uneasy calm. The arrest of Colin, Marina's devoted but misguided assistant, had quelled the immediate panic, but whispers of the poisoning still rippled through the lanes. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her sharp blue eyes drifting to the garden, where a single rose drooped under the weight of morning dew. The cracked mirror from the film set haunted her thoughts, its fractured surface a metaphor for the broken lives and hidden truths she had uncovered. Colin's actions had been driven by fear and loyalty, but Clara Harlow's threats suggested a deeper, more sinister motive, one Miss Marple intended to lay bare. A knock at the door announced Dolly's arrival, her cheeks flushed from the brisk walk. She swept into the parlor, her hat adorned with a jaunty pheasant feather, and settled onto the sofa with a dramatic sigh. "Jane, you've done it again. The whole village is talking about how you caught that young man out. But I want the full story, every detail, mind you." Miss Marple's lips curved into a gentle smile. "It's never quite as thrilling as it sounds, Dolly, but I'm happy to share what I've pieced together. Shall we start at the beginning?" Dolly leaned forward, her eyes gleaming. "Oh yes, please, and don't leave out a thing." Miss Marple set her teacup down, her voice soft but clear, as if recounting a tale she'd told many times before, though each telling was new. It began at the premiere with poor Heather Badcock's death.
She was so full of life, so eager to reconnect with Marina about their meeting years ago. But when she spoke, I saw something in Marina's eyes, a flash of dread, as if Heather's words had stirred a ghost. It wasn't grief or surprise, it was recognition, and it set me wondering. Dolly nodded, nibbling a scone. That look of hers was queer, wasn't it? Like she'd seen something awful. Precisely, Miss Marple said. I suspected then that Heather's death was no accident. Poison is deliberate, Dolly, and it requires a motive. The letter in Heather's pocket, "You'll pay for what you did, no one forgets," pointed to a grudge, but I couldn't be sure if it was aimed at Heather or someone else. My visit to the Women's Institute confirmed Heather's obsession with Marina, and the mention of silent phone calls suggested that someone had been watching her, perhaps to silence her. Dolly's eyes widened. You mean someone thought Heather knew something dangerous? Miss Marple inclined her head, possibly. But it was my visit to the film set that clarified things. The cracked mirror there, it reminded me of Tennyson's poem, The Lady of Shalott, where a curse is revealed through a shattered reflection. It felt like a sign, a symbol of something broken in Marina's world. I learned from Maggie, the runner, and Lola Brewster, the co-star, that Marina's past in Hollywood was fraught with scandal, a love affair with a married producer, Vincent Harlow, that ended in a fatal car crash. Mrs. Finch at the Blue Boar filled in the details. Vincent's wife, Clara Harlow, blamed Marina, and a young actress lost a role to her, harboring bitterness that lingered. Dolly gasped, her teacup rattling. So it was all tied to Hollywood. But how did Heather fit in? That was the question, Miss Marple said, her eyes distant. Heather's meeting with Marina at a charity gala years ago seemed innocuous, but it must have touched a nerve. I suspected the poison was meant for Marina, not Heather, and the second attempt at the fate, poor Jenny's collapse, confirmed it. The killer was targeting Marina, and Heather had been an unintended victim, perhaps because she took Marina's drink by mistake. Dolly's eyes widened. And Colin? How did you know it was him? Miss Marple's fingers brushed the edge of her saucer, her voice steady. Colin was protective of Marina, almost to a fault. His nervousness at the premiere, his argument with a waiter, his evasive answers on the set, all pointed to a man with something to hide. When I learned from Ellen at the gala that he'd been arguing on the phone about keep it quiet, I began to suspect he was entangled in Marina's past. My rumor at the gala that a witness had seen the poisoner was a calculated risk, Dolly. Guilty hearts are brittle, and Collins broke under the pressure. When he dropped that vial, it was as good as a confession. Dolly shook her head, marveling. But he said he was trying to protect Marina. That's what I don't understand. Miss Marple's eyes softened, though her tone remained firm. Colin's loyalty was his undoing. He admitted to staging the poisonings as a warning, to scare Marina to leave England. He'd learned that Clara Harlow, Vincent's widow, was in the country, renewing her threats against Marina. Colin thought a staged attack would convince Marina to flee, but his plan went horribly wrong. Heather died, and Jenny nearly did. He wrote the letter to make the threat seem real, but his panic led to chaos. Dolly frowned, setting her cup down. But what about this Clara Harlow? Is she still out there plotting revenge? Miss Marple's expression grew thoughtful. That's the final piece, Dolly. After the gala, I spoke with Inspector Craddock, who confirmed that the police are investigating Clara's whereabouts. She was seen in London recently, but there's no evidence she was in St. Mary Mead during the poisonings. Colin's actions, though misguided, may have drawn attention to her, preventing a real attack. I suspect she'll be found soon, but for now, the village is safe." Dolly sighed, her shoulders relaxing. "So it's over then? No more poisonings, no more fear?" Miss Marple smiled faintly, her gaze drifting to the window. "I believe so, Dolly. The mirror's truth has been revealed. It was cracked by jealousy and revenge, but Colin's confession has mended it in a way. Marina is shaken, but she and Jason have decided to leave St. Mary Mead to finish their film elsewhere. The village will return to its quiet ways, as it always does." Dolly leaned forward, her eyes eager. "And what about Lola Brewster? She was so bitter about Marina. Did she have anything to do with it?" Miss Marple shook her head. "Lola's resentment was real, but it was professional, not murderous. She wanted Marina's spotlight, not her life. People like Lola thrive on drama, not poison. No, the true danger was Colin's misguided devotion and the shadow of Clara's hatred." Dolly sat back, her eyes bright. "You're extraordinary, Jane. To think you saw it all from that one look in Marina's eyes. What made you so sure?"
Chapter 4. The Tangled Web of Motives. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across St. Mary Mead, painting the village in hues of amber and rose. Miss Jane Marple sat in her parlor, her knitting needles idle in her lap, a rare occurrence that betrayed the intensity of her thoughts. The cracked mirror on the film set, Lola Brewster's venomous glances, Colin's guarded demeanor, and Jason's Rudd's protective vigilance had woven a complex pattern in her mind. But the heart of the mystery still eluded her. Heather Badcock's death was no random tragedy. It was a calculated act, and Miss Marple was certain the key lay in Marina Gregg's past, a past that had cast a long shadow over the present. Her visit to the film set had confirmed that the poison was likely meant for someone else, perhaps Marina herself, given her startled reaction when Heather spoke of their past meeting. The anonymous letter found in Heather's pocket, with its chilling warning, "You'll pay for what you did, no one forgets," suggested a vendetta, but against whom? Miss Marple's instincts told her that the answer lay not just in St. Mary Mead, but in the glittering, treacherous world of Hollywood, where Marina once reigned supreme. She rose, smoothing her cardigan, and decided to pursue a new lead, Mr. Giles, the florist, whom Mrs. Clement had mentioned in connection with a disagreement with Heather. It was a slender thread, but Miss Marple knew that even the smallest detail could unravel a mystery. She also needed to learn more about Marina's Hollywood days, and for that she would need a source less guarded than the film set's denizens. As she gathered her shawl and basket, a plan formed, a visit to the florist, followed by an afternoon tea at the Blue Boar Inn, where she hoped to encounter someone with ties to the film world's gossip mill. The florist shop, a quaint establishment tucked between the butcher and the bakery, was a riot of color and scent. Roses, lilies, and chrysanthemums spilled from buckets, their fragrance mingling with the earthy tang of potting soil. Mr. Giles, a wiry man with a perpetually furrowed brow, was arranging a bouquet of dahlias when Miss Marple entered. "Good afternoon, Mr. Giles," she said, her voice warm and unassuming. "What lovely flowers! I'm looking for something cheerful for my sitting room, perhaps some of those marigolds." Mr. Giles brightened, always pleased to discuss his craft. "Marigolds, Miss Marple. A fine choice. They're sturdy, full of life." He paused, his hand stilling, not like poor Mrs. Badcock. Terrible business, that. "Indeed," Miss Marple said, her tone sympathetic. "I understand you worked with her on the floral arrangements for the premiere. It must have been quite a task." Mr. Giles' face clouded. "It was, and no thanks to her, if I may say so. Heather was a good sort, but she had a way of taking over, kept changing the order, roses one day, lilies the next, said it had to be perfect for Miss Gregg, nearly drove me to distraction." Miss Marple tilted her head, her eyes keen. "That sounds trying. Did she mention why she was so particular about pleasing Miss Gregg?" Mr. Giles shrugged, snipping a stem with more force than necessary. "Said she'd met her years ago and wanted to make an impression. kept going on about some charity event in London. I told her it was just flowers, not a royal coronation, but she wouldn't hear it. Then when one of the bouquets arrived late, my supplier's fault, mind you, she gave me an earful in front of half the village." Miss Marple nodded, her mind cataloguing the detail. Heather's obsession with Marina was becoming a pattern, one that had evidently stirred something dangerous. "Did you notice anything unusual at the premiere? Perhaps anyone lingering near the arrangements?" Mr. Giles frowned, his hands pausing. "Now that you mention it, there was a chap hanging about the display table. Not one of my lads, a stranger, tall with a scarf pulled up high. Thought he was just admiring the flowers, but he seemed shifty. Didn't stay long." "A stranger?" Miss Marple's voice was soft, but her pulse quickened. "Did you see where he went?" "Out the side door, I think. Didn't think much of it at the time, with all the chaos, but with what happened to Heather." He trailed off, his face paling. Miss Marple thanked him and purchased a small bunch of marigolds, her mind racing. A mysterious stranger at the premiere, combined with the unfamiliar waiter Beatrice had mentioned, suggested an outsider's involvement. But why target Heather or Marina in such a public way? She resolved to pass this information to Inspector Craddock, but first she needed to delve into Marina's past. The Blue Boar Inn was a bustling hub of village life, its low-beam ceilings and polished oak tables filled with locals and the occasional film crew member seeking respite from the set. Miss Marple settled into a corner booth, her marigolds adding a splash of color to the table. She ordered a pot of Darjeeling and scanned the room, her eyes landing on a familiar face, Mrs. Ada Finch, a retired seamstress who had once worked in London's theatre district and was known for her encyclopedic knowledge of showbiz gossip. Mrs. Finch, her silver hair piled high, was sipping sherry and chatting with the innkeeper. Miss Marple caught her eye and beckoned her over, her smile inviting. "Ada, how delightful to see you! Would you join me for a cup of tea?" Mrs. Finch, never one to decline a chat, bustled over. "Jane Marple, you old fox, what brings you here? Not just the tea, I wager." Miss Marple chuckled, pouring a cup for her guest. "You know me too well. I've been thinking about poor Mrs. Badcock and that dreadful business at the premiere. It's got me curious about Marina's world. You used to work in the theatre, didn't you? Did you ever hear anything about Marina Gregg's time in Hollywood?" Mrs. Finch's eyes gleamed, her voice dropping to a conspiratory whisper. "Oh, Marina Gregg, she was the talk of the town in her day. A real siren, but trouble followed her like a shadow. There was a scandal, must be 15 years ago now, when she was filming Starlight Serenade. Fell hard for a producer, Vincent Harlow. Married man, of course, with a jealous wife. Rumor was Marina got pregnant, but it all went wrong. There was an accident, a car crash, some say, sabotage. Vincent died, and Marina disappeared for a year. Never quite the same after that." Miss Marple's fingers tightened around her teacup, though her face remained serene. "That tragic. Was there ever any talk of enemies? Someone who might have blamed Marina?" Mrs. Finch leaned closer, her voice barely audible. "Plenty. Vincent's wife, Clara Harlow, swore Marina had ruined her life. There was talk she'd threatened revenge, though nothing came of it. And then there was a young actress, can't recall her name, who lost a big role to Marina. She was bitter as gall, spread all sorts of stories. Hollywood's a nest of vipers, Jane. You don't get to Marina's heights without stepping on toes."